Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Colin Khoury. I work both in international agricultural research with a Global South mandate, but headquartered in Colombia, and also national agricultural research in the United States. In both of those capacities, I focus on plants, people, and the planet, with applications both in wild plants and in domesticated or cultivated plants, and also the interface between those, particularly crop-wild relatives, which has been my main focus over many years. And one of the central research questions, or philosophic questions, if you will, that I've been interested in for a long time is the narratives that we ask ourselves or tell ourselves, or our ancestors tell us about diversity and about loss or change of that diversity, and whether they're true, what's really happening in the world, and where we're headed with diversity. And then what are those implications to conservation? And so I've gotten interested, even though I don't think I'm naturally strong with math, I've gotten interested in metrics and trying to figure out if we can actually measure change, loss, how we're doing, if we're doing a good job, if we're not. And so I have two projects to share with you today, both about wild and cultivated plants. The first one starts with wild, and the next one is about cultivated. And they wrap around some of our big global goals. The first one is actually a project that we were awarded to work on Target 13 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Aichi biodiversity targets. If you don't know these targets, and if you don't mind having a little patience with me for a bit of text here in the beginning, both of these targets are aligned with each other, one in the Sustainable Development Goals, one in the CBD. They both say some very interesting things. In short, they say, by 2020, we will have comprehensively conserved our agricultural biodiversity, our crops, our livestock, our wild relatives. And also there's some interesting texts about including other socioeconomically valuable plants. And so maybe two things that you might see here. One, the date. And I've talked about this in various ways, although my science has changed, but over the last couple of years, and we just keep getting closer to this date, and it gets a little bit more scary to give this talk. And the other thing is to point out is that there's genetics in here. In both of those, there's genetic diversity. It's not just species diversity or more general diversity. It's genetic diversity that we're talking about. And so this is one question is, why has this come up and is so intense? Even in non-agricultural circles, in the Sustainable Development Goals or in the CBD, why is this happening? And someone in the crowd here once said that there's no technical reason why we should actually have extinction happen. We know how to do it. And so maybe that's one reason, is that maybe the world actually thinks we can do this. It's just a matter of getting going on it. But the short end is that we're really not doing such a good job of keeping ahead of extinction and all of this stuff. So what is it if it's not a technical issue? So again, I'm interested in measuring. Like, how are we doing with all of this? And the genetic level, if you will. And one of the big problems is that we don't have genetic information, certainly not comprehensively. And so if you'll allow me, I'll just talk about indicators for a second. Indicators, as I've started to understand them, fall into, let's say, a spectrum with two edges. One edge is that you try to be super comprehensive across every species, for instance, that you want to look at, but then you have to be fairly simple about your metrics. And so for the SDG 2.5, for instance, when we try to measure agricultural diversity in seed banks, there is an indicator existing that's measured by FAO, but it's simply the number of accessions in seed banks. And fair enough, useful, but with a number, how do you know how much you can know you're advancing, but how much are you advancing? And how do you know when you're done? On the other side of the spectrum is to be not comprehensive, to have case studies and go deep, and then we can know really well for one species or a group of species how we're doing, but is that representative of the whole group that you're interested in? And so there's the challenge between all of those things. What we have tried to do is argue that we can use ecogeographic methods, non-genetic methods, as proxy for genetic diversity, try to be comprehensive, that is, try to measure a lot of species, and use automated tools and open data to try to make this as efficient as possible to be very thorough in it. So it's somewhere in the middle. It's trying to accomplish everything. Usually doesn't work. We'll see what you think about how we did. So what we did is we argued that we could gather a species list as large as we could. It ended up being about 7,000 species. And this was particularly a gap for CBD Target 13 for those socioeconomically valuable plants. And so we found that there was about 7,000 wild plants that we thought that we could look at in here that fall in these categories. In the next slide, you'll see those categories in larger text. And then we gathered occurrence information. That comes from herbaria, like here in Kew, and also comes from gene bank databases, et cetera. And then we use that information to model the species distributions. Yesterday, there were some questions about how effective modeling is, et cetera. That's all very true. There's a lot of questions in that. But we modeled with that information, and then we did what's called gap analysis, which is, I'll explain in a second, but it's using models and then comparing those models to our conservation systems and seeing how much those models are represented fully in the systems. And then we come up with metrics at the global level, national level, regional level, et cetera. To be efficient in this, to be able to measure this, and it's not just once, an indicator should be measured every couple of years, we need open data, and it needs to be well curated. And so the best data source that we were able to find for useful plants was the World Economic Plants database in the USDA. And these were the number of species or number of taxa that fell in these categories, about 7,000 plants. I'd worked with doing this modeling and gap analysis for many years now. I'd never done over 1,000 plants, and that took me about 3 years to do. It was my PhD. And so 7,000 was a big move forward. We needed to become more automated, quicker, and more efficient in our modeling, but we were able to do it over a couple of months. And so this is a richness map that is almost 7,000 species that we did have information for. If you put all the maps together on one and then you color them so that the more and more in one place they get darker colors, then you get this. It's not a super even distribution across the world. There's some areas where obviously there are useful plants in these regions, but there wasn't that much information or that many occurrences. But you do see a fairly global distribution, and you see some intensity in Europe and China, North America, et cetera. So then we do the gap analysis, and let me just give you an example for one species. So this is a wild coffee, and these are the occurrence points that we gathered, and the green is the model that we were able to develop off of those points. So that's the modeling part. Then we get into the conservation gap analysis. The first thing we do is we map the points that come from conservation systems, from gene banks, from living plants in botanic gardens, et cetera, and we can map them, and that's what's shown in red. Those are where people had gone and collected material, and they really are in gene banks now, or they're in botanic gardens. And so then we ask the question, well, how much does that red comprehensively cover the whole distribution? And we asked that in a couple of different levels, both geographic and then also ecological. That is, do those red points, do the habitats that are in those places, does that cover the habitats that are everywhere there, or the bioregions or ecoregions, if you will, or not? I think you can tell geographically from this point that this does have some good conservation, but it's not comprehensive for this species if you just look at the reds. And then we also ask about protected areas. And so we have some files that tell us what are the designated international or national protected areas. Those are the blues. And how well do those cover the distribution of the species? And so we're looking both ex situ and in situ. And we do that for all of the species. This talk really isn't about giving you results, but in case you're interested, what we found, the narrative that we're telling ourselves that we're not doing a very good job with conserving diversity was certainly true with this 7,000 plants. What our indicator ended up being, if you measure it at the global level, like here, is what proportion of all those 7,000 plants fall in the categories that we would consider sufficiently conserved or of low priority. And that actually ends up on a scale of 0 to 100. If you give it between 50 and 100, and the higher you go up in numbers, the better you're doing as a species. If it's between 50 and 100, that's well conserved or low priority. And then we say, well, what proportion of all the species in the world, 7,000, are well conserved? And we found that only 3 across the globe, if we measure it as a balance of ex situ and in situ. The ex situ is really quite poor. In situ, we're doing quite a bit better, in fact. At the national level, if you want to just see, so this is again the measurement of, is the proportion falling in the less than 25% of your species at your national level are well conserved or of low priority, then you get down here. If you're up here, that means that greater than 75% of your plants are pretty well conserved. As a combined, like nobody's basically doing very well. In ex situ, nobody's doing very well. But in situ is quite interesting, and particularly Europe seems to be doing pretty well. Again, as indicators, not as important as where we're at right now, but how we're doing after a couple of years. Wanted to talk about where this is all going. And so this does become a formal indicator for the HE biodiversity targets. We, of course, did some papers, but maybe more importantly, everything is open access, the code, the data, et cetera. If you're interested, please check it out. But for the decision makers and maybe for the public, we also needed to make this accessible online. And so there's a website, if you're interested, if you just go to, if you put in useful plants indicator, CIAT, you'll be able to find that. And then the official one is on the Convention on Biological Diversity's website, and you can get to it there. And this is theoretically where the reporting national reporters need to go and look up how we're doing and find the information for their country and report back to their decision makers. That's where we're at with that piece of work. We need to keep measuring it every couple of years, and hopefully I'll be able to, I'm an editor in this journal. I'm very proud to be, and so I'll be part of this community, and hopefully I can come back and tell you that we're doing a lot better after a couple of years. I'll now go over to the cultivated side and tell you about a project that we're working on that is actually considerably more complicated. And this is a project that's trying to understand crops, about 350 crops, let's say the most important, if I can say that, around the world, and how they're doing in terms of their conservation, their importance, et cetera. And this is for the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. That is an independent international treaty, but it's aligned and embedded with the Convention on Biological Diversity, in case you're not aware about it. The theory behind the treaty, and also behind trying to come up with metrics, is that crops and their diversity, their origins, are in places in the world. They come from places, but they're needed often in other places, their diversity, for food and agriculture, for production, for use. If you don't mind me taking a second too, I wanted to say, since that wonderful talk by Chris this morning, this map has been my biggest impact, certainly in terms of people seeing it around the world. And I think it was the visualization of it, and it started a lot of conversations for people. I also had even people in the room write me to tell me I was completely wrong about some of the origins here, which I appreciate and appreciated. A really good conversation starter. And one of the things about it when we talk about plant blindness is that people apparently had never not only known that potatoes, don't come from Ireland, they come from, but they didn't think that plants came from somewhere at all, that they had no history, or had never thought about that. And it opened up something interesting there. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd also like to say that I just published a paper that I was very excited about. It was about collaborations between scientists and artists and what could happen between that. It's called Science-Artist Collaborations to Increase Research Impact, if you want to look it up. It was quite a fun thing. But I want to play a game with you. So this treaty, as I mentioned, is about diversity and people needing it. And maybe that's intuitively obvious to the folks in the crowd, but maybe it's not. So please humor me with a little bit of a game. This is, by National Agricultural Statistics, the top 8 crops in terms of consumption, in terms of food availability, importance to calories, in 3 countries. I'll tell you what the crops are so that it's not confusing for you. Your task as a group is to figure out which countries that's their top 8 crops for calories. Yeah, it's not particularly in the order that it should be. These maps on top will move to the right place. And so one of these countries, their top 8 crops is maize or corn, is wheat. This is sugar cane, sugar beets. This is rice, sunflowers, soybean, my apologies, barley, which can include beer, and potatoes. Corn, sugar, rice, soybean, beans, palm oil, rice, barley. Wheat, sugar, barley, potatoes, canola, rapeseed, corn, maize, sunflower, coconuts. Sorry. Mexico, South Africa, Ireland. And I'm not sure how much time I have left to play this game, so we'll just find out.
I got lost.
Yep. Excellent. Perfect. So in just a second, I'm going to start asking you. Any questions? So you know I'm trying to trick you.
You are or you're not?
Well, I'm not. This is real data, but I'm hoping you'll be surprised by the results. All right. Please yell out. Just yell out. You can overlap each other.
Ireland.
I hear a lot of Ireland. I hear a little South Africa.
Mexico.
I hear some Mexico. I heard a lot of Ireland at first. So there's diversity in the group. I heard more Mexico than anything here. Mexico. Are you ready? If someone can explain this to me, I understand it might have to do with confectionaries of some sort, but
Maybe the data.
so we can talk more about this at break, etc. The point is, we need plants. We don't even know that we need certain plants in certain parts of the world that we thought we needed. And so this treaty has this really interesting but not really rational and certainly not scientific list of crops and how we should be sharing them across the world. Right now, this is on the list already of, we all know that we need these crops. Everybody needs these crops. We should share their diversity, etc. These ones somehow got on the list, but it's a little bit confusing why these ones are on the list and these ones are not on the list. But right now, and probably in November, there will be a big decision about how this list will change or whether to get rid of the list entirely and treat all food and agricultural crops. So the indicator that I've been working on is try to provide an evidence base for the decision makers in the treaty based on 5 metrics, based on how important crops are, how much interdependence around the world there is in terms of their genetic resources, how much demand for genetic resources and where the supply is, and threats. This is all I could really say about this indicator. If you're interested in some of the results, this isn't really online yet in terms of a final thing, but I assume we're going to make these presentations available, so you'll be able to see this if you don't write it down now. We have some, and you can look up which crop is the most important in the world if you didn't already know, and maybe it will surprise you. Thank you so much.